Alright, let me ask you a question. What do all three endgame modes in HSR have in common? The answer is a time limit. Whether you're interested in MOC, Apocalyptic Shadow, or Pure Fiction, all three of those modes end up with the exact same thing mattering. How fast you can clear them, or I guess whether or not you can clear them at all within a certain time frame. Sure, the types of units that you use in each mode are a little bit different, like Pure Fiction wanting Air Edition characters like Himiko and Herta, and Apocalyptic Shadow wanting a high toughness break efficiency unit like Boot Hill so that you can get the buff from breaking the boss super quickly. But in all those cases, you're not really fighting against the boss, nor do the characters you choose really matter that much, because what you're actually fighting against is the arbitrary time limit or action value that Hoyo decided to set for that mode. Gacha games have been trending this way for quite a while. It became mainstream for gachas with Genshin Spiral Abyss, but then it was copied into HSR with the MOC, further into ZZZ with the regular version of Shiyu Defense, and even into games outside of the Hoyo sphere like the Tower of Adversity and Wuthering Waves. Personally, I have to say that while I'm generally pretty okay with these modes, I think they become a little bit more iffy when it's in a turn-based game like HSR. See, in a game like Genshin or ZZZ, at the very least there's some aspect of mechanical skill, like knowing how to dodge attacks, iframing with your skill or your ultimate, properly doing your damage rotation between your supports and your DPS, and things like that are all aspects of the game that you can save times in your runs with. On the other hand, in HSR, there's almost never actually any in-the-moment decisions like a dodge or doing something with one unit to interact with another. Like, there's a couple exceptions like a Yunli Pari or maybe even ulting at the right time if your Harmony unit happens to be running the Dance 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 light cone, but scenarios like that are pretty uncommon or tied behind non-player friendly things like getting a specific rare light cone. I also think that as a result of these games requiring you to clear within a certain time frame, there's definitely been a lack of development in terms of how the fights actually play out. For the most part, what we're getting in terms of difficulty increases or HP increases or stall mechanics like the normal version of the Adventuring boss in HSR or something like the Worm bosses for those of you that play Genshin. I definitely do have to give Apocalyptic Shadow credit here in that it changes the bosses to make them more engaging, but that's only one mode out of 3, and we only get an iteration of that mode once a month. It doesn't help that they've already started reusing bosses in that mode either, like Kafka, who's in there for a second time right now. On top of that, if you look at the endgame modes overall, they don't often do anything that affects the player to make it more difficult. For example, they can make using certain skills cost more SP, or introduce more mechanics like the Guardian Shadow from Belobog, or even more enemies like Sam that punish you for doing certain things like using SP. Alongside that, enemies also never usually do large chunks of damage in these modes, which incentivizes players aiming to clear these modes really quickly to sometimes drop using a sustain in favor of having another buffer, or for players that don't do enough damage to do the same so that they could potentially clear stages they might not have the damage for otherwise. As it stands, most of this content really comes down to just being a stat check or a character check. Do you have the right amount of crit or break effect? Are your supports the right ones to buff your DPS, or in the case of follow-up teams, buff both of them? Do you have enough HP to survive the random hits that you might take if you don't bring a sustain? Nowhere in any of that is there really any skill. The player doesn't have to do any kind of thinking in the middle of the fight because for the most part whether they win or lose is decided before it even begins. Relics, traces, the gearing in general, all of that is done earlier, and it takes out some of the potential agency that players have in the actual fight. As a result, the combat in this game really just feels like a puzzle. If you figure out how to crack the code on that puzzle, it's the same as you being able to clear the stage. The problem is that these puzzles all pretty much have the exact same solutions, you just have to beat the enemy within the time limit. And to be clear, that's definitely not a bad thing. Like, I enjoy figuring out the puzzle. I just also think that it would be fun to have some in-the-moment decisions matter too. This is where I feel that the HSR devs could actually take some notes from ZZZ's special Shiyu nodes, or even their own other game mode of the simulated universe. And what I mean by that is creating an endgame mode where the purpose isn't to clear within a certain time frame, but to survive an enemy while also eventually defeating them. In ZZZ, they added the ambush and disputed nodes in their endgame mode Shiyu defense. They slightly changed the aggression of the mobs, and more importantly, made them deal more damage. While that might seem boring on paper in the same way something like an HP pool increase in our normal endgame modes is, what it actually would do is end up incentivizing different playstyles, and it could even open up avenues for Hoyo to add relevance to underutilized playstyles. For example, if an enemy is doing too much damage to you, bring a unit to freeze them, or run a shielder. Maybe run 2, or hell, even run 3 shielders and add in a healer for good measure. Sure, it might take you 7 years to clear the stage, but at least you'd be able to get it in the end. For players that don't want to rely on more gimmicky strats, at the very least they need to go back to actually using some kind of sustain, or maybe a more tanky DPS like Blade. Something like this would actually give Hoyo a reason to introduce more units like him, or maybe even add preservation units to the game since they haven't done that in a while. On that note, reminder here, we have only gotten 2 preservation units since this game launched. At this point, it's kind of a dead archetype unless your name is Aventurine. I talked about it in a previous video, but I feel that the path as a whole is being held back by shields as a concept acting as overhealth, but if there's a new game mode where it's essentially required that you bring a sustain, I feel it could open new opportunities for them to be added again. What I'm really looking for here, and what I will always harp on throughout any video that you watch of mine, is variety. Realistically, while using a different damage dealer in Pure Fiction versus MOC does offer some of that, at the end of the day you're basically running the same team compositions you would, just with a different DPS piloting them. It ends up feeling uncreative, a little bit too samey, and most importantly, the longer these kinds of time-based modes stay our only form of endgame, the less fun they're gonna be. Like, don't get me wrong, again, I still absolutely do enjoy the current endgame that we have, but I also recognize that they're not all that different from each other, and in my opinion, that's something that could definitely be improved going forward. To be clear, I'm not saying that the only solution for variety going forward is something exactly like MOC, but the enemies hit you harder and the time limit is removed. That's just one option. Another idea I had is that they could take some notes from the simulated universe by giving us extra abilities to use while in the fight. It's perfectly fine if they don't want to give us more than one skill or something like that in the normal game, but in a difficult endgame mode, I feel like they could. For example, instead of us having the train mechanic from the Sunday fight or the engine of creation punch from the Cocolia fight, why not have a mechanic that lets each individual unit block for a turn on a cooldown? Combining that with the mode not having a time limit would actually result in there being those in-the-moment decisions that can make or break your clears and therefore be more interesting. Like, do you want to get SP this turn and risk your character dying because you didn't block, or maybe you want to skip a turn so that the enemy boss doesn't counterattack you, so use your block button there. And that's just if the button was used for blocking. I can see a ton of different use cases for something like this if it were to be added. Another idea is something that I heard from a recent Mr. Pokey video, and that was the idea of having some kind of endgame that requires you to run 3 different teams rather than the 2 we have now in every game mode. Even if it was just added under the current iteration of MOC, while we'd still be going against a time limit, at the very least it would offer more variety in team compositions. Sure, obviously you could still run the same meta follow-up and break comps you've always ran, like Phasial Topaz on Chamber 1, Ratio Moes on Chamber 2, and a Firefly break team on Chamber 3, but at the very least it would give you an opportunity to run something different like an old Hybrid Carry team or Dot there instead. I definitely think something like that could be expanded on further to encourage you running specific teams for each of the 3 chambers, which might be interesting as well. If you took the extra ability idea I mentioned earlier and combined that with this, those extra abilities could be the reasoning for running different teams. Like, what if there was an ability that triggered all of your follow-ups to go immediately, or maybe something that gave your Hybrid Carry a bonus instead? Another thing to consider is raid content. For example, there could be an extremely high HP enemy like a 50 million HP Svarog. Stuff like this is done in other gachas like Nikke and Blue Archive, where it incentivizes using multiple teams by either making the damage the boss deals scale up the longer the fight goes on, or just dealing enough damage that you can't reasonably sustain it infinitely. As your first team is defeated, your next team would come in, and if the only requirement to clear the raid was defeating the boss, it would result in a scenario where you could use multiple teams to slowly chunk down the boss's health bar. If different tiers of this were introduced, similar to Apocalyptic Shadow or Pure Fiction, it could even be something for all accounts regardless of where your progression through the game is. One last idea I had is that they could introduce an endgame mode that has character restrictions, maybe like a permanent tower like the one ZZZ just got, but you can only use a specific element per tower. Like, if you had a stage that only let you run lightning units, that would not only incentivize you to run units you might not otherwise, but it would also give Hoyo a reason to flesh out elements with units they don't have yet, for example adding a preservation unit to the lightning element. Those are just some ideas I had or have heard from around the community, and I think some of them are actually pretty solid if they were ever to be put in the game. Hopefully they do get put in the game because, like I said, while the current endgame modes are mostly enjoyable, I do see them getting stale at some point. For the time being, this is basically the meme of, I like this, but I would also like this. I will say I'm definitely looking forward to the Pure Fiction update, and hopefully that will keep it interesting and also incentivize Hoyo to update their other modes. Who knows? How about you? Are you satisfied with the current endgame that we have, or would you like to see some changes to them? If so, what would you like to see? Feel free to let me know down in the comments below. Anyway, that's my rant. Thank you very much for watching, subscribe, and if you haven't already, maybe give my other videos a shot too.